write, and also her book is coming out, in just a few months, but especially because it's Mother's Day on Sunday, so it feels like really good timing to do a mother-daughter book event. I thought I would start by reading a little bit from Stroller. This is just from the end of the book, but I don't think there's any context that will be too confusing without having read the beginning. Each of the chapters kind of work as a standalone essay in a way, so if you haven't read it, it should still be pretty clear. I'm going to try to see if I can put this back up here while I read, though. Should have just left this where it was. All right, does that sound okay? Okay. Thank you. My kids Thea and Simon are here in the front row. I always love having them. I should say my daughter Thea also loves to write. She's written some books as well, and she hopes that someday they'll be published. And she'll be doing an event here maybe as well someday, and we can do another mother-daughter or grandmother-mother-daughter event. And Simon is in kindergarten and learning to write and has written some really amazing stories about the things he likes to do, like Minecraft and Legos. All right. And Minecraft Legos. The combination of the two. All right, so this chapter is called Strolling. When Ellen, who is a character from a movie called Away We Go, and that's really all you need to know about her. If you haven't seen the movie, it's really funny, and I recommend it. But there's a scene where this woman sort of like loses her mind because she's anti-stroller as like a very personal political belief that strollers are evil and cause you to push your children away from you, and how could anyone ever use one? So that's the context of her screaming. When Ellen screams that she loves her children and so would never push them away from her, she's acting out a deliberate caricature of a certain type of contemporary American mother. But she's also getting at the heart of one of parenthood's most painful, unsolvable contradictions. The balance between the imperative to protect and to push towards independence that I'm always recalibrating. Putting my children in their own beds, coaxing them to sleep through the night, introducing them to solid food, sending them to school, teaching them to ride a bike, to swim, to read, to tie their own shoes, are all ways of pushing them away from me, because I hope, more than I've ever hoped for anything, that there will one day in the very distant future live in this world we've shared after I'm gone, and that when they do, I will have taught them what they need to know. In part 7 of her poem, Ultrasound, Scottish poet Kathleen Jamie writes, "Our baby's heart on the 16-week scan was a fluttering bird, held in cupped hands. I thought of St. Kevin, hands open in prayer, and a bird of the hedgerow nesting there, and how he'd borne it until the young had flown, and I prayed, this new heart must outlive my own." According to Seamus Heaney's St. Kevin and the Blackbird, St. Kevin is said to have, in extending a palm outside his narrow cell, provided a resting place for a blackbird. Moved to pity, Heaney wrote, he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. Pushing a child in a stroller is an act of separation, but it's also an act of safeguarding. And as I recently began to worry when I walked through the neighborhood with then 4-year-old Simon's long, coltish legs dangling nearly to the ground, might not just be a portable little nest, safe, but also limiting, constrictive. Jamie's essays and poetry about exploring the world with young children are the foundation for Melanie Duckworth's contemplative essay, Everyone Wants to Escape from Their Own Lives Sometimes, Don't They? In that piece, Duckworth reflects on the parallels and ruptures between the experiences of visiting London as a young single woman and later as an academic with young children. 12 years ago, nearly to the day, I arrived in London with a huge backpack, a little backpack, and a brick of a laptop. I was brimming with excitement, anticipation, freedom, and nerves. Walking along the street carrying it all, I felt like a giant turtle. Duckworth remembers the Grody Hotel where she stayed, visits to the British Museum, and a mix of anxious, aimless wandering. Last week, Duckworth writes of a recent trip she took for an academic conference. I arrived in London with Felix and Antonia as my companions. We stayed in a clean and shiny hotel near Hyde Park. Duckworth recalls that at the end of this second trip, we walked from our apartment to the station to catch the train to Edinburgh. My big backpack was strapped to my back. The little backpack was slung over the handles of the stroller where Antonia sat as Felix walked beside me. When he got tired, he sat in the stroller and I strapped Antonia to my front in the baby carrier. We trundled slowly over the cobblestones like an oversized turtle. The train journey itself was less painful than I had anticipated, but there was a blissful moment when both children fell asleep on top of me until the conductor arrived and asked me to move my bags. I know so well these less peaceful than anticipated train rides and these blissful moments. Before Thea and Simon were in school, I loved to take them on adventures that exhausted all of us. A stranger once took a picture of us at Grand Central Station after a day at a children's art museum, lunch at Pan Quotidien where Simon's stroller served as his side chair, many trips up and down subway stairs in which a stranger wordlessly grabbed one end of our stroller while I, then unaware of the risks of falling to my death or dropping Simon to his, held the handles and hustled down to make the train. In the picture, one of my favorite photos, we were all exhausted, shimmering with sweat from a late spring day in Manhattan, and waiting to board a commuter train bound for Connecticut, on which I'd already planned to pull baggies of goldfish crackers and little milk cartons I'd been saving for late day exhaustion out of my overstuffed diaper bag. There was both joy and triumph in having shown the children I love so fiercely around the world I love fiercely. A world of running, of exploring, of traveling, even of walking slowly through my neighborhood, wondering how the new house down the block is coming along. In the best of cases, these stroller days felt like I had managed to make a nest for my children, steady on a branch, while still, through some magic, showing them the world. The exhaustion of these outings was not at odds with the joy and triumph I felt when we boarded the train home, or I toweled off their little bodies, finally cleaned from all the dirt of the city, or the running trail, or the dusty corner of the playground. Traveling or running or exploring or navigating the world with them, no matter how hard, feels like triumph, and it's proof of my self-sufficiency and successful defiance of the expectation that motherhood would be an end to all that. Although motherhood restricts journeys, Duckworth notes, it also enables and requires them, be they as simple as a walk to the bottom of the garden in the snow. By the time Thea finished first grade, we were down to one stroller. The first to go had been the travel system. Once Simon outgrew his infant car seat, it was useless, and apparently these are so ubiquitous and the one I had so unremarkable that it took weeks before I could even give it away. I sold the double bob for $50 on a neighborhood tax sale page, thinking that with Thea in school I'd have no use for it. When the pandemic closed schools, I regretted that decision. I donated the heavy, unwieldy two-child stroller I'd pulled all over Manhattan and Brooklyn when it became clear that by the time we'd be traveling again, we'd have no need for it. On an icy morning in February, I was hurrying to drop Thea off at her elementary school and bring Simon onto his preschool. I loaded him in the single running stroller to save time and help him safely navigate the lingering icy patches on the sidewalk. A jagged patch of refrozen slush caught the edge of the rear of the right tire and shredded it open. I pushed him in the stroller with a flat tire for the rest of our commute, but when I got home and took a closer look, I saw that at the very least, the tire and tube would need to be replaced. This stroller, the one my parents bought for me when I was pregnant with Thea, was so dirty, missing so many pieces, its canopy, its cup holder, a piece that made the straps adjust for different sized children, that there was no sense in selling or even donating it, so I put it out on the curb for garbage collection the next Thursday morning. Simon is too big for our remaining stroller, but occasionally I use it anyway. We live far enough away from his school that at the end of a hot June day, it's sometimes hard for him to make the walk home. Sometimes I think, or maybe just imagine, that I see other parents of a more sporty variety, the kind whose children learn to swim at 2 and ride two-wheelers at 3 and play lacrosse at 4, and who have not been so passively perambulated since toddlerhood, giving me a look, judging me in the way I imagined the Upper Baby Vista parents judging me, or knew myself to be judging them. But I love these walks with Simon, the pace of our perambulating so different from any other pace in my life. Slower than driving, biking, running, and even than the clip at which I'd walk on my own, but still faster and more even than the erratic pace Simon and I keep when, holding hands, running late, arriving just in time for the late bell, we hustle down the sidewalk strollerless. On the stroller walks, we have time to consider the houses we pass, the flags we see flying, the construction vehicles at work. In the last weeks of the public school year, we often pass parents in what look to be college students newly arrived home from their summer vacation. Often the parents and I make eye contact, a silent and almost mournful recognition passing between us. In June, just as I'd started working on this book, I was finishing up an early morning run when I passed a mother pushing her double bob running stroller past the park across the street from the little in-home preschool that both Thea and Simon attended the years they were 2. Her children looked to have about the same number of years between them as mine. Her daughter about the age Thea was at the end of the school year that she attended that preschool, and her son, like Simon had been then, still a baby, big enough to sit up but probably not yet crawling. I felt a pang of nostalgia so intense that knowing it was rooted in romanticization of those years did nothing to ease its ache. I imagined a whole life for this woman, a husband traveling for work for 10 days and 9 nights, trying to fit in training for an upcoming half marathon without childcare, and children who rose before dawn, that I realized only later was a replica of the precise circumstances I'd been in when the sun was rising at just this hour, when the late spring weather was humid just like this. In my own real life version of those 2 weeks, run every single day he was gone, and only once with help from my parents, who would gladly have helped more. We'd gone to the playground, and I'd orchestrated simultaneous naps so that I could meet my first major freelance deadline. We'd eaten ice cream for dinner and hosted my longtime friend on a visit from Manhattan. After Thea and Simon were in bed, I'd watch the entire season of Big Little Lies before my free HBO trial ran out. Even with Nick away, I'd run and ridden and seen friends and watched adult television. Motherhood had not been an end to all that, to me. The stretch of days had been hard, but it had been brief, and it had been easy in some important ways. The kids were young enough still to be strapped in, to nap reliably each day, to find magic in the vine-covered public easement that runs between the senior center and the town dump. I had been able to keep them with me everywhere I went, and to do, at least for a short time, everything I needed to get done. It was slower or slightly more encumbered, but it also felt somehow more significant. In the most literal sense, running with the stroller for all the days leading up to that half marathon made the race itself, which I ran without the stroller, feel easy by comparison. The pre-dawn hours I spent on my couch finishing my essay made a creative life feel like something I had the power to mine and cultivate, even with, or maybe because of, the pram in the hall. It wasn't all like that, of course, not that stretch of specific days, and more generally not that phase of life when I was so sleep-deprived that I frequently walked into walls, or when I was breastfeeding one child while sitting on the floor of our half-bathroom potty training the other, when I felt often that my entire identity had been deconstructed and I had not yet found a way to reassemble it. When the physical demands of motherhood and their differences from fatherhood felt most stark and sometimes led to the darkest of marital resentment and discord. But I miss Thea and Simon very much as I ran past that double stroller, both the 6 and 4-year-olds I'd left at home when I laced up my running shoes that morning, and the 2-year-old girl and baby boy who, no matter how much I tried to record and how many iPhone pictures I'd taken, were becoming ever more hazy memories. The days of hot mornings pushing a stroller had also been days of baby music class, months when parenting choices I made were manageable and concrete. What kind of soap would be gentler on sensitive infant skin? If there was whining in line for ice cream, should we leave right away, or should I give a stern warning? The things my children needed from me were mostly things I was able to give them, and they were rarely without me, even when I was running. I lived my life not separately from theirs, the way even in early elementary school it has already become possible, with long school days and drop-off play dates, but fitted neatly in the spaces where naps and preschool allowed. Our stroller, our many strollers, I guess I should say, made it possible for parenting young children to be exactly what I feared was impossible. I could bring Thea and Simon with me on the adventures I loved most of all. I pushed Thea on trails cut through a meadow at an old estate, where I'd once coached and raced cross-country meets. It was slower and more awkward and sometimes uncoordinated or even briefly frustrating. But on a sunny fall morning, I'd done something I loved in a place I loved with a person I loved. The same was now true of the subway treks and the Brooklyn Bridge walks and even the Tribeca playground. I'd never have thought to spend time on an early Sunday morning at a Tribeca playground, but I was outside with my family eating an almond croissant and drinking an iced coffee, people watching, puzzling over how to make sense of where I fit in and didn't, just like I've been doing in various ways and places since I was a child myself. The moments of self-consciousness about my dirty stroller, and by the end showing spots of mold on its canopy next to the up-a-baby vistas, have been balanced by the sense I often have that all these miles with my kids and I have traveled together have changed us. Thea will be 7 soon, and I think often of the lore about all the cells in our body regenerating in that period of time as a neat match to the image I have of the tires rubbed bald from training runs and playground trips and travel I've shared with my children. Thank you.
So Amanda, oh, the mic.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's very, very personal for me. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process of writing, and in particular, how did you come to know about object lessons?
Probably about 5 years ago, I was just driving somewhere in the middle of the day and heard on one of those midday public radio shows a woman named Summer Brennan talking about her object lessons book, which is called High Heel. And I hadn't heard of her as a writer, but I really thought she was interesting. And then as I sort of looked into the book, I thought the concept for the series was really interesting. The idea is basically that all the books are roughly the same length, pretty short, and they all use a single object as a way of examining something about our culture. And and some of the objects are much more tangible, like a stroller or a high heel. But one of them that just came out not too long ago is soccer, and another one I just saw the cover for is grave, as in like where people are buried. So they can sort of range from the seemingly very mundane to something that already would make you think like, grave, like that already has a lot of weight to it. But I just thought that I'm someone who, I've always loved writing nonfiction, but sometimes have a hard time with the fitting a neat and tidy argument into my writing from the beginning, even like in school when I would have to write, those analytical essays we all grew up writing. I would often get comments like, great paragraph, but I'm losing track of the argument here. I felt like for me, having an object to focus on structured me a little bit, and it was, I think some writers maybe would feel constrained by that, but I loved having those sort of like training wheels, just as a way to keep my brain from meandering off in some direction.
Had you thought about Stroller as a metaphor before you heard about the series?
No, I had just more generally been wanting to read more serious writing about parenthood, and serious I don't necessarily mean like medical books. I had a lot of those, like our pediatrician gave us one that says, if the baby's fever is above this amount, go to the hospital, and I definitely found that useful, but I wanted something that was more like thinking about, we didn't have our kids particularly young, but I just didn't have a lot of friends with kids, and so I felt like I was just going into this totally unknown territory socially, and I really missed, the way my friends and I might talk about work or talk about dating or talk about marriage. I wanted something like that with motherhood, and I just was having trouble finding books that felt like they did that. So I had been wanting for a while to write more about motherhood in a way that wasn't sentimental, but also wasn't just, like a textbook or a guide, because I do think those are useful, but I felt like there were a lot of those already out there. And then I saw somewhere that the Object Lesson series was going to publish a few new books, and initially I had thought of Running Stroller specifically, and that's what I pitched, and the editor wisely said, well, that's a little bit too specific, like, I know it's a short book, but that's really, I know you like to run, but that's a lot of Running Stroller. I was like, okay, fine. But as soon as I thought of the Running Stroller idea, I thought of the metaphor, because I thought about when I did run a lot with the stroller, I shock myself by like, I hadn't been running all that much, but when I would run in a race, it would be better than I thought it would have been, because I ran track and cross country in college and had considered myself a pretty serious runner, and then it was like, wait a second, why am I running faster than when I had a coach in like a training room? And I attributed it to the strength from the stroller, or in part at least. So I thought that was an interesting metaphor for motherhood, that the things that were hard and made the individual daily runs less frequent and shorter and slower actually had contributed to becoming a stronger runner indirectly.
Mm-hmm. You don't have memories of being in a stroller yourself?
No.
No, that's interesting.
Deanne, Simon, do you guys remember being in strollers?
Yes. I
You do?
remember the stroller was falling apart.
There's a metaphor.
And then you were away from my house, and then you were go in it, but we were very squished.
Oh, yeah.
And just left it out when it was lightning to run in it before that.
No, I think you invented that. I think that's not exactly accurate. So, no, I don't. In a few minutes, the audience, including you, can ask some questions. Thanks.
So how old were you? I'm going to ask the question.
Okay.
I really want to know, how old were you when you first thought, I like this writing thing. I really want to do this.
I remember wanting to be a writer from probably the time I was in second grade or so. I read this book, Harriet the Spy, and the character in that book wants to be a writer and has some adventures that go wrong by spying on all of her friends and writing about them in a notebook. But I just thought like, oh, I didn't know you could do that for, I don't know where I thought books came from, but that, just reading about a character who wanted to be a writer that was also a little girl, thought like, oh, okay, I can want to do that. Yeah, so that's the first job I remember seriously wanting to have.
I remember, I recently came across a short story that I wrote in 2007, which was the first time I decided to go back and try writing fiction again. That summer, Amanda happened to be living back at home with us. She'd finished her master's degree classwork, but she needed to do her thesis. and she finished the classwork early, so she had some time to live at home while she also worked. And I remember Amanda sitting across the room at a table, and I was sitting in a chair, both of us just banging away on our computers, writing in the same room at the same time. And it was, I think that's what, that experience, sharing that experience with you, where every so often you would read me something you were writing and I would read you something I was writing, made me think, you know, if she can do this, maybe I can do this. So you are, okay, you are the reason I'm writing again.
I have such fond memories of that. It was like, I think, kind of a long time from the end of fall semester, so it would have been like January to the start of the school year when I started. I taught high school English for a long time, and I had started teaching in September. So, but in a lot of ways, it should have been, you know, like a not great period of my life. I had just broken up with my boyfriend of 4 years that I thought I was going to marry, and no comment on a recorded thing.
Just, it's hot here.
Anyway, but, and you know, and also I grew up in the suburbs, and you know, I was 24, none of my friends were living in the suburbs, so I was just hanging out at home all the time. But like, I remember cooking, and like my dad and I would watch The Sopranos together, and my mom and I would write together, and it was like, I have just such a fond memory of that time, but especially the structure of the days, you know, like before my job had started and I could just devote all morning to writing. That was really special time for me too.
So you wrote in the book about the availability of a stroller letting you carry on with who you were. It wasn't the end to all of that. But writing requires sitting still and either paper and pencil or a computer. How did you find the time to write with these little kids in the stroller on the move all the time?
I had this really amazing writing teacher when I was in school in college. Her name's Megan Steelstra. She's also published several books that are really good, so just as a plug for her. But one of the wonderful, wonderful things about her as a professor was that she would talk really openly with us about the writing life and how much rejection is involved and frustration and sort of just that, not saying that there was one formula for how you have to go about trying to make a career as a writer, but that it is something you have to do consistently, and you're going to have heartbreak, and you know, that even if you're amazingly talented, you're going to be told no a lot. So I feel like from a pretty young age, I had a strong sense of like, you just have to be tough about this. And I have told this story to a few people before, but when I was a young, like right at that year when I first started teaching, I went for a run with one of my childhood best friends who was one of my cross-country teammates, and we're going for this run after work, and I must have been saying about how I was, you know, not getting any time to write or hadn't been writing as much as I wanted to. And she is like the nicest person you've ever met in your life, so you have to imagine that this took her a lot of strength to say this. But she said, why are you making sure you run every day but not write every day? Like, you're not going to be a runner. Like, she wasn't saying like, oh, just give it up, like stop running, but just like, isn't running something you do for mental health or fitness or health? You know, like they're all, yeah, great, do that, but like, you would never just skip that part of your life, and you're telling me you want to be a writer, and so why not take this hour we're going to run right now and go write instead? And even though I do think for me, I actually do have trouble sitting still, and I feel like this is such a common thing for people to say, like, you know, I just have to move to like calm my thoughts. I definitely feel like that, and I know if I didn't run, it would be really hard for me to write because I would have my brain going crazy. But I think the two things went hand in hand, like the idea of establishing a practice that even if you can only do it for 30 minutes, or even if you have to do it, you know, in an inopportune, like writing on the back of a napkin while someone's taking a nap, or pushing a stroller up a hill or whatever, like just don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That's so cheesy, but I think about that a lot. And with writing, and I guess that mentality came maybe from distance running, but I had that for a while about writing, I guess. Wait a sec, sweetie. I think we're going to do questions from the audience after Nani's done with some questions she planned out. Okay.
So those were the questions.
Okay.
Unless you have something, what should I have asked you that I didn't think of asking?
No, nothing in particular. I didn't mean to.
No, I know.
No, I don't think so. I think that's it. I guess the only thing I would just say is that I feel like there's not a lot of times when I've talked about the book, some version of the phrase like the answer is both. Like are strollers good or bad? I mean, that's such a silly question. Like what? Or like are the expectations that you bring, like, I guess what I really want to say is that in the part I read, I realized as I was reading, without the context of what comes earlier, I feel like there could come across this idea of like, mothers should never be without their children, or like shouldn't ask for help, or shouldn't have childcare. And that's not at all what I think, but also I hope that the book as itself as a whole doesn't make that case. There's a chapter where I talked with a woman who's a physical therapist, about running strollers. I was specifically wanting to ask her about the physiology of, running while pushing something in effect. It can be quite hard on your back. And I thought she was going to sort of talk about that. And instead she said this line, something along the lines of, this is such an American thing to do, to create a product to solve a bigger problem. Like, why, one, are women feeling like they have to begin working out immediately after they have a baby? Two, feeling like they can't take the baby to the gym childcare, or ask their partner to help, or ask their parents to help, or like, why can you not be away from your baby, also not, God forbid, not be working out, like that. And so I thought we were going to be having a conversation that was very, anatomical about the torque when you have your arms extended, and we did. But so I'm saying that sort of as a little bit of a other side of the chapter I read tonight comes at the end of the book, and it's a little bit of a, I don't want to say sentimental in a bad way, but a little bit of a nostalgic reflection on the end of that period of parenthood. But I also feel like I just want to underscore that I think it's part of what was interesting about writing about strollers is a lot of the way a stroller works as a metaphor is about, I think, the lack of support for moms, like both at an individual level and a like broader cultural level. Societal level, yeah. Looks like we have some questions. I know Thea had her hand up, and then Simon, you're next, okay?
I have two questions.
Okay.
Number one is the person who said, like, why aren't you inviting?
Yeah.
Is that person Laura?
No, I didn't know Laura yet at that time. You're right, Laura is one of the nicest people you'd ever meet too, so I can see why you
Say that to a lot of people.
I'm lucky to know a lot of nice people, but you're right. Laura is also one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. Yes, Simon.
And I stopped.
You can come next. Yes, Simon.
Did you write like 5 million copies of Stroller? This is a lot of
I just wrote one copy, and then the publisher, this is kind of interesting. No, this is kind of interesting. So I wrote the book, and I sent it to the editor. He sent some edits, and then it goes through copy editing, and then something called page proofs, where you check and make sure any last changes. That happens a couple rounds of that, and then at a big printing press, a big kind of like a factory of books makes
Good. I thought you said you made a mistake.
I did make a mistake. I confused Susan Sarandon and that other person who I was confused Susan Sarandon with.
Sigourney Weaver.
Yeah.
Oh.
So yes, I made a mistake that no one caught, and I am embarrassed about it, but that was my mistake. Thank you for bringing that up. Thea, did you have one other question? And then maybe non-family members might have questions too. Go ahead, sweetie, if you have another question.
Do you have advice for
The two pieces of advice I have for people who want to be writers, whether that's when they grow up or now, if you are grown up, is you always have to be very honest in your writing. That same teacher I was talking about before, Megan, she would always say, like, think of what it would make you shudder, or like the thing you cannot write, that's what you have to write. And she didn't literally, I don't think, mean like spill your deepest, darkest secrets and just publish them out into the world. I think she meant like if there's something you're avoiding in your writing and trying to tiptoe around and like, ooh, how can I avoid, mentioning the uncomfortable contrast between the sentimental sense of pride I get from spending all my time with my children and how there are problems with women in a lot of circumstances being expected to do that. Like, that might be awkward to talk about or uncomfortable to talk about, but you have to write about things that can make people uncomfortable, or else people are going to read your book and they're going to say, it feels like something is missing from here. Maybe they wouldn't know what, but they'll say something isn't totally honest in this book. And then the other piece of advice I would have is you just have to be okay with having people tell you no a lot. I have a spreadsheet of all the people who tell, like, well, not just to tell me no, but like, of any time I like try to do an event like this one here, a magazine or an idea for a book proposal, and I always write, you know, like sent this to these people and here's what they said, and way more no's than yeses. So that's normal. I do have some yeses, yeah, occasionally, like just once in a while. But
so one of my favorite things from the book is when you talk about child-friendly and not child-centric and vice versa. And for folks who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I'm curious if you could maybe just kind of outline that.
sure. So there's a chapter that's sort of about really generally stroller culture outside of the U.S., but I have to say, like, focused totally on anecdotal and personal experience. I said something to my editor, like, how do I make it clear that I'm not a cultural anthropologist? And, you know, the book is only 30,000 words long, so I could either write 70,000 words about, like, baby carriers and the history, you know, or I could just gloss a little bit. So we lived in Switzerland for a few years when I was a kid, and I had some stories that my mom had told me about when Clay was a baby there, and the attitude toward children and their parents. Somebody put your hand up for a moment, please. And then I also have a good friend from college who is a German professor, so she spent quite a bit of time living in Germany with her 2 young kids. And she said that phrase, that Germany is, let me see if she said the phrase, Germany is child-friendly but not child-centric, and the United States is the opposite, child-centric but not child-friendly. And what she meant by that was, you know, she said if you go to Germany, for example, like, there are these coffee shops that people love to go to where there's a spot in the coffee shop for the adults to sit there and have their coffee or chat or work or whatever they're doing, and then there's a whole other room with toys and, you know, places for kids to play. And no one thinks you're a bad parent if your child goes to play in the playing area, or you enjoy having a cup of coffee alone with your spouse, whatever, or work or whatever. But she was saying in the United States it's the opposite. That even just from a pure infrastructure level, like, you know, public transportation is not accessible for strollers, but also, you know, for wheelchairs and stuff too. But just that the school day doesn't line up with the work day once kids are in public school. So there are lots of ways that our society doesn't center what children and their parents need, but then the expectation is that, or she was saying, she felt like the expectation was that at the same time parents are expected to focus all of their decisions as the family unit on their child, but that the society itself isn't actually set up to make any of that easy or widespread, I guess. And that really resonated with me a lot, like the idea that, you know, there's this trend of people, if they go on an airplane with their baby, they like bring presents for the other people on the airplane. I think it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. I'm sorry if someone did that here, but like, a baby is a human that exists. Like, if your baby cries, I know it's stressful, and like, why would you expect someone like to bring you a present because they have a child? That's so weird. I don't expect someone who wears rose perfume to give me a present. Like, that's weird. Anyway, but I think that kind of thing, that it's like, oh, like, you know, at the same time, there's sort of like a disdain for children and their parents, but also an obsession with maximizing children's potential and like putting them in a bazillion activities and judging parents very much based on the parenting decisions they make. Like, are you co-sleeping? Are you having a carrier? Are you having a stroller or whatever? Yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question. Any other questions?
I have a question way up in the back. Okay, so one thing I loved about your book was when you talked about how parenting has kind of become like a commodity, and there's different brands and like the cool stuff versus the not cool stuff. And as a new mom, that really resonated with me because there's a lot of like, I didn't know until it was too late about the Vista.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit more about like, you know, why you wrote about that and what, how that has informed your parenting?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I've been thinking about that part of the book the most since I finished writing it, because I've been in the subsequent months noticing that not only in other aspects of parenting culture, but just other aspects of culture in general. I think of, like, I teach college students now, and I taught high school for a long time. I think that's a problem in education too, but I'll stick to parenting for right now. I do feel like I had never really experienced a phase of my life that I noticed that kind of like identifying yourself with a purchase before. Like, I know that people do that. I'm not a big team sports fan, so like I know that people like wear their team sports things, and you know, people have sometimes like bumper stickers on their car about a hobby they have or maybe political beliefs or whatever. try to signify something about themselves. But until parenting, I didn't even know that people cared what kind of a stroller. Like, I didn't know someone would recognize a stroller and say, like, that's a that and that. Like, it was like cars. Like, you know, someone, like, I don't know much about cars, but even I know that, like, a Bentley is a fancy car, you know. So, but it felt like the amount of visibility that a stroller offered made it kind of an ideal object to explore that. Because I feel like that happens. I mean, when I was in a new mom's group when Thea was a baby, I just felt like I was entered another planet. Like, sometimes on the, you know, on the online forum we had, or in person at the group, people would be like, oh, I heard this brand of bottle is the best. And I mean, on the one hand, when you're sleep deprived and exhausted, I bought a million dumb things on Amazon in the middle of the night because I was like, maybe this will make the baby sleep. But it was I just never had been in any sort of community that the way people talked was by talking about what they bought. Like, that just was, I know there are other communities like that, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but that was totally new for me. And I found it to be, like, really upsetting. And then sort of the bigger implications of that are how I think sometimes it relates to people thinking of their children as commodities, you know, like, that I see this a lot in, you know, the affluent suburbs where we live in Connecticut, where it's like, if I can get little Johnny into lacrosse at age this and then get the tutor for this. I mean, so many children that are quite young already have multiple extracurricular activities every single day, and it's sometimes because they like it, or sometimes because the parents need, you know, something because maybe they're working or whatever, but a lot of times it's the idea of maximizing a child's market value, and it's so upsetting. Like, and it just turns my stomach, honestly. Are we getting close on time? Or no? Okay, we're good. Okay, Thea.
What do you mean by, like, people have abstract?
Well, like, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but sometimes people might have, like, okay, first you're going to go to a special one-on-one swim coach who teaches you swimming, like, not the swim team, but just one-on-one, makes you the best swimmer you can possibly be. And then after that, you're going to go to a special one-on-one ballet lesson to really perfect your ballet lessoning. And then you're going to, you know, like, I'm not saying any activity is like this. Sometimes people do it because they're really fun. I don't mean your activities that you do, but sometimes I think parents can think, if I can make my kid the best ballet dancer, the best swimmer, they'll be the best kid. Or I'll be the best parent and everyone will see that I'm the best parent. They'll see that I love them the best, or that I myself am very athletic and very smart.
And have the best stroller.
And have the best stroller. That's not moldy or dirty or falling apart.
Kind of not true.
That would be kind of not true. You're right, Simon. It would be kind of not true.
So would you write another object lessons book?
I would. I don't think they usually have. I haven't known of them ever having people write two. There are, I think, about 80 books in the series. And they vary from the authors or poets or academics or artists or novelists. So they have a really cool variety, but I don't think they tend to want to go back to people. The idea I had for another one is a very abstract object, which was road race. And then I basically have the same argument. Like, people are just doing road races to get items. But, so maybe that's why they don't want two people reading, one person writing two books.
Well, now that you've moved on from that idea, what are you working on?
I'm trying to write a book, right? I'm working on a proposal for a book about education. You know what we've been hearing a lot in the news about the mental health crisis among teenagers and college students, and also at the same time about teacher shortages and teacher burnout. My husband's a high school teacher at a local public school, and I taught high school for a long time. I said that way too many times tonight, but I taught myself. And we have kids in public school, and I want to try to make the argument that both of those things actually are rooted in this maybe like past 30 years obsession of applying business models to education. Actually, for the same reason I was talking about with parenting, but this idea that like, then who's the consumer? Is the child the consumer, or the parents the consumer? Is it the education the product? Is the child the product? Are the test scores the product? Is the grade the product? Like, and I think when you send, whether it's overtly or indirectly, the message to children, and I'm using that even to mean like up to college students, but if you send that message that like your value depends on how high you score or how well you are ranked, like, that's not the only cause of mental health. Obviously, you know, struggles with young adults, there are many things in the world that are rightfully alarming, and obviously the pandemic has a role, so I don't mean to say that's the only factor, but I do want to think a little bit more about the consumer culture angle in the context of education, because it's something that it feels like is getting worse. I just finished, you know, grading for the semester, so I'm in an especially cynical mood right now. Prime book proposal writing time. wrote that they wish the book had had more history, and I thought that that was a bit, to me, that wasn't as fun to research, so I didn't include as much of it. But I think that would have been easy enough to include just a little bit more history of even just like the patent history, and then maybe a little bit more when I wrote the chapter about strollers abroad, even if it were just a sort of brief. I just found out yesterday that the book is getting translated into Korean, which is super exciting and feels like that's very exciting to me. But then I thought I didn't write anything about Korean culture in the book, and then I felt embarrassed. Like why didn't I even think about trying to write about strollers? I don't know what stroller culture is in Korea, so made me feel sort of ignorant. And then like, who am I to be writing a book that someone wants to read in Korean if that doesn't even acknowledge this culture? So I guess those two things, and maybe not necessarily in terms of volume writing a lot about either of those things, but just touching on them.
Well, it's only a 30,000 word book.
Yeah.
So you can cover everything, even on one little object.
Yeah.
You can't possibly do that.
And I think what's kind of cool about the word limit is it makes you choose, like, am I going to go super, super, super deep? Like, I'm sure someone could write 30,000 words on patent history of strollers alone. I personally probably wouldn't want to read that, or someone could write 30,000 words of pure memoir, on the other end of the spectrum, just their own memories of using a stroller or something. But sort of like figuring out where on the spectrum of super niche, like detailed research-based writing to more broad land.
Yeah, I have one more. I know
Okay,
this-
no, I appreciate it so much.
Your writing to me often reads very nostalgic, and I'm curious how intentional that is and how you cultivate that.
It's not intentional. I just am a very nostalgic person. Like I feel like I've been like that since I was a kid. I'm reading this book right now about nostalgia, and I'm forgetting the name of the book right now. I wish I could remember it or the author, but the book is actually about the history of the word nostalgia being like a longing for home. And then I also recently read this book by Susan Cain called Bittersweet, which is about the same idea. Like, why do some people find almost like relief and pleasure in that feeling of being nostalgic? And I totally have that. Like, she describes it as the way that when you have like a loose tooth, it can feel good to push into it with your tongue. Or like if you have a bruise, it can feel good to push on it. And I like the most basic example is, why do some people like sad music? And the book opens with her describing listening to Leonard Cohen music and sobbing, and all of her friends are like, why are you doing that? She's like, I just love it. Her friends are like, okay. So I think part of it is that. But I also feel like, I mean, this is just how I am, I guess, but I just feel like I really love the people in my life, and I feel often like very painfully aware of time passing. And it definitely has been more intense since I had kids, but I feel like I was like that even like in college. I'd be like, we only have 3 years and 363 more days together. So I think just by nature, maybe.
Precociously nostalgic.
Yeah, I guess.
I want to touch for a moment on, you talked about the woman who said you have to write what you're afraid of, or write what you fear. I definitely had that experience when I was writing the novel. No spoilers, it's a novel you have to read to find out what happened. But there's an event in the novel that I danced around, and I'd say, well, it's fine, I don't have to make it clear because I like ambiguity, like you like nostalgia. But still, eventually I came to the point where I realized, this is not a book. This is not the book I want to write, and this is not a story that needs to be told if I don't come and face the central thing that needs to be in it. And so, with great trepidation, I wrote it in there, and you'll have to read it to find out.
I think that's partly like, there are two ways I think that advice works. I think one of them is just from the perspective of making the writing, like the sentences more energetic and making the writing more engaging. But I think it also works sort of philosophically that the reader, you have a contract with the reader that you're supposed to tell them the story the best you can, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. And if you're withholding something, not because you don't know it, or it's not, the research isn't there, or you haven't, I'm sure there's research I just didn't
Or you decided
find.
it wasn't relevant
Right.
or something like that.
But that it's sort of like in the same way that the reader would feel tricked if you had sort of like a red herring, in a mystery novel, if it's not a well-constructed mystery, and then there's sort of a red herring that never goes anywhere, and then it feels like it was just manipulating you to read faster. I think I think it's really hard because I don't know if anyone else has this experience if you're writing, whether just for yourself or for publication, but sometimes I literally have to close my eyes when I'm writing. Cause like I can't see these words coming out, they're too vulnerable or too embarrassing, but then even if they don't stay in that form, that's almost always like, well, that was the heat of
That was the
that
thing.
scene or
That
that
was the
story
thing.
or, yeah, and so I find like along those lines of like, you know, approaching something that feels scary, I try to tell myself, no one's ever gonna read this, no one's ever gonna read this, no one's ever gonna read this, like I don't have to show this to anyone, and then I'll deal with it later if I am gonna show it to someone, and then even just saying like, you know, this is a less personal example and more professional example, but if I do write this book about teaching, I have to make some decisions about how to write about the places I've worked, and I would never write about specific students, I feel like that's a violation of a relationship, but you know, I might allude to a particular administrative decision or something in a way that could be uncomfortable for me or for my husband who still teaches where I used to teach. And so then as I'm writing, I'm like, no one will ever read this book, it's never gonna sell, and if it does sell, no one will ever read it who works there because they don't read anyway, and like and then I can figure that out later, but I don't know. I think you just have to selectively believe no one's gonna read your book and then hope everyone's gonna read it, you know?
Yes, I can relate.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book and like where we can order it and when to, yeah, I know you said the date and everything, but maybe remind people.
It's called Something Better, and it's supposed to be released October 17th, so about 6 months from now. It should be available for pre-order the end of May, and it's from Touchpoint Press, so it should be available for pre-ordering everywhere. And it's been a crazy process. I, you know, got my publisher in COVID, and that was, it's still crazy. Publishing is completely wacko, and it got really wacko during COVID times. So coming out on the other side of that, and of course it's my first book, so I didn't even know what to expect. And still I was surprised not knowing what to expect. But it's wonderful. It's a wonderful opportunity.